Hi, I'm Chris Long, ham radio VK3AML, and in this series of videos I'll take you to one of the most beautiful, historic and rarely seen parts of Tasmania, the eastern Bass Strait Islands, and the holy grail of remoteness, Deal Island, midway between Flinders Island and Wilson's Promontory. We needed to go to test this device beside me, a modulated light beam communication system for transmitting speech and data, rather like microwave radio, but with the promise of broader bandwidths, greater privacy, and the freedom from any radio licensing requirement. I can fire it up. It's not particularly bright, we're not talking something like a laser here, and it's quite eye safe. But this is actually transmitting my voice in variations of brightness at the moment. The beam is broad, but it doesn't diverge. It's well collimated. We'd already set a 168 kilometre world distance record with similar gear in 2005, but could it somehow link Victoria with Tasmania? Nobody had ever done this. A small group had achieved digital transmissions of only their own call sign by Morse and one way back about 10 years earlier, but it wasn't qualified as a contact until it was a two-way contact. Furthermore, we wanted to transmit something useful like speech or data or video. For this, we needed a high Tasmanian vantage point in sight of Victoria. An old, well-elevated but disused lighthouse site was ideal, and that's exactly what Tasmania's Deal Island offered. The January 2021 expedition was our fifth try to reach Deal Island. Attempts to cooperate with proposed de-expeditions there in 2011 and in 2019 failed. There were lack of shared aims, poor planning, leadership grabs, ego, and a narrow focus on HF radio, all contributing factors to the blame. One guy claimed that our cutting-edge stuff had nothing to do with ham radio. Another told me to apply for membership after I'd already been invited to participate with the group. With the better part of $1,000 to be sunk into this venture, that was unacceptable. We were pushed out twice in a decade, we learned our lesson, and neither of those groups that I mentioned ever made it to Deal Island. By late 2019, my wife and I decided that our only option was to organise and finance our own expedition. We had an excellent team of 4 friends who'd already toured New Zealand together, ready to go. Stephen Langley, ham radio VK3SL, is a music teacher, a cellist, having an interest in the history of electronics. With 5 offspring who regularly go camping with him in remote locales, Steve knows about equipping people with reliable survival equipment, budgeting for the right type and amount of food, water and safety gear. Dave Stewart, ham radio VK3ASE, is a recently retired ABC News sound recordist and camera operator. He's a hardened camper in remote environments with a full complement of lightweight HF transmitting gear, solar panel power supplies and a deep expertise in radio communications, not to mention good video camera gear and editing experience. Mike Groth, ham radio VK7MJ, is a recently retired scientist with a PhD in radio astronomy and nuclear physics. His knowledge of low-light measurement and detection techniques, atmospheric physics and circuit design are our backbone in scientific expertise. Then there's me, ham radio VK3AML, background in electronics, later broadcaster and author, specialising in the history and preservation of non-print media, film, photography, sound recordings, television. Another 20 years in museum curatorship and historical documentary video production, but now retired. In November 2019, Dave and I toured the South Gippsland ports, Welshpool, Port Franklin and Port Albert, assisted by a local operator, Chris Chapman, VK3QB, shopping for boat charters to Deal Island. We spoke to a few boat operators who were landlocked by the appalling weather, as you'll see. But in the end we went for a 50-foot sail-assisted motor catamaran, the Nooramunga, out of Port Albert, run by the team of Wynne and Hobson, who've both been in the maritime game since childhood. The Nooramunga travels more regularly to Deal Island than most other craft, from the wharf where the old lighthouse resupply vessels once operated. We booked to go to Deal with them on the 9th of January 2020. On the day before, Steve, Dave, Mike and I all travelled down to Port Albert to spend the night prior to embarkation. A few kilometres away from present Port Albert, Steve and I investigated old Port Albert, established in 1841, the earliest port on the South Gippsland coast, now a ghost town near a caravan park, with a few picturesque old houses from the 1850s surviving in ruins. The old port in the Albert River estuary, Macmillan Bay, is now occupied only by an occasional local vessel, lots of seabirds and millions of mud crabs on the mudflats. Down to the old Alberton pub for what we thought would be our last hearty mainland meal, then up at 5, down to the Nooramunga, where the weather had turned sour, and Wynne told us that the trip had to be postponed. A single shot of the Nooramunga's interior. Dark disappointment on everyone, but all glad that safety was paramount. The next possible departure date was April 2020. Mike Groth and I used the next week to scout the hills of South Gippsland for vantage points with a view to Deal Island for our Shore Lightbeam Communications group. The engineers Chris Morley, VK3CJK, and Ralph Edgar, VK3WRE, both from the Latrobe Valley, have the necessary specialist lightbeam gear to intercept our Deal Island signals. Bushfires were raging further east, and the smoke put such a pall over southern Australia that it would have blocked our lightbeam. Perhaps the delay was a godsend after all. At Carajung, in the eastern Strzelecki Ranges, we had the elevation necessary, but lots of tree cover blocking views. There was also a load of bull discouraging our usage of the site. Not the first time communication has been blocked by excess bull. Along the Grand Ridge Road further east at Black Warry, with an elevation of 650 metres, we noted coops in the pine plantations to the south, with good views towards Deal, but we moved on as we had better hopes for the 740-metre summit of Mount Tassie, the source of Gippsland's television transmissions. But there the view towards Deal was blocked by trees and a low ridge.
Deal Island is somewhere over there, and that hopefully through the gap in the trees.
No hope. Blackwarry looked like the most likely spot. Then the 2020 bombshell dropped. The COVID pandemic crisis was on us, and travelling to any part of Tasmania became illegal. The April 2020 departure date passed, so we rescheduled Deal Island for September 2020. But the border was still closed, so we rescheduled again for January the 8th, 2021. By then, our team member Mike Groth had been ill and his mobility was compromised, so he had to withdraw from our team, to our sincere regret. Mike's design work on our light beam gear was vital to the project. It was terrible for all of us not to have Mike with us for the culmination of his effort. Stephen Langley's 18-year-old son Henry, ham radio VK3ASE, took Mike's place on the team, and though his skills were different, he proved to be an equal asset to our crew. Unlike the previous summer with its bushfires and its smoke, the end of 2020 was very wet, washing the air clean with exceptionally good resultant visibility. It was looking good for our light beam contact. To achieve a link between Victoria and Tasmania, you have to cross the borderline at latitude 39 degrees 12 minutes south. The nearest island to that border is Hogan, but it's uninhabited, treeless, and has only a survival shelter on it. Deal is inhabited with forests, buildings, and a mountain 300 metres high. First, we have to do 3 hours on the road to Port Albert, then a weather-dependent 7 to 10 hours on the boat to Deal Island. We decided to forego staying the night at Port Albert on January the 7th. So after an afternoon sleep at home in Melbourne, we stuffed Steve Langley's minivan with all of our gear at midnight, and Steve drove us through the night for the 220 kilometres to Port Albert, arriving at 4 a.m. It was cold and windless, perfect for the departure to Deal Island. Our first view of the Nooramunga in pre-dawn darkness. Then we tried to catch a bit more sleep as dawn broke. There we could load the Nooramunga for the 8-hour voyage to Deal. Wynne came out at 5:30 and helped us to load up. We could hardly believe that on this, the 5th attempt at getting to Deal, everything was falling into place. We actually were leaving. And there was plenty to see on the way. For the first hour of the trip, the Nooramunga winds its way through the narrow channels between South Gippsland's low and largely flat sand islands. The sand in these channels slowly shift with tides and river discharge. We were glad to have someone as experienced as Wynne Hobson at the helm, constantly checking marker buoys, depth soundings and radar. There were plenty of pleasure craft out in the protected waters. Goodbye to Port Albert, our last contact with civilization for the next 4 days. One of 2 passengers for Erith Island near Deal. There were 12 people aboard. Skipper Wynne and his wife Carol, another couple who were friends of theirs, the granddaughter of an old Deal Island lightkeeper and her daughter, and of course the 4 of us. Cormorants fishing for breakfast. Skipper Wynne Hobson keeping an eye on our course. No need for sails yet, there was no wind. An upturned channel marker on Sunday Island. There were thousands of seabirds standing sentinel on one of many sand spits bordering the shipping channel. Pelicans, cormorants, other seabirds. Nearing Bass Strait, the sails were unfurled. At the entrance to Bass Strait, there's a massive barrier island with an enormous acreage of sand around it, the Clonmel Sands, where in 1841 one of the earliest steam-powered ships on the Victorian coast, the paddle steamer Clonmel, went aground. The bones of the ship are still under there somewhere 170 years later. Around the sands, Bass Strait breakers seem to boil and bubble on shoals and shallow water. Wilson's Promontory and Redondo Island in the background. Seasick but attempting to smile. No proper sleep for 20 hours, both of us. I fed the seagulls, as it were, several times over the stern rail, and my camera work was unsteady. Don't try to be macho and think you're a great sailor. Take your quells. The Seal Islands, off the east coast of Wilson's Promontory, are still in Victoria. Rabbit Island is the largest of these, but the only one that was ever inhabited was Cliffy Island, a former lighthouse island, with its old dwellings now crumbling away. 1 hour later we came to the Hogan group of islands and the Tasmanian border. Here, the wild men of Australia's first export industry, seal hunters, camped immediately after Bass and Flinders' reports of plentiful, exploitable animals in the newly discovered Bass Strait. They were the first Europeans in the area, 30 years before the foundation of Melbourne. And by 1815, they'd slaughtered the seals to the edge of extinction, killing their own industry. Fur seals have started to recover today, but the sea lions and sea elephants are practically gone. One gets little impression of the sheer size of the sea elephants from the drawings of the Baudin expedition in 1802, but this photo of a rare tamed cow sets the scale. The bulls were even bigger. A more positive influence on the strait was Captain Lort Stokes in 1842, who charted the shores and the depths of the strait so precisely that his research forms the basis of Bass Strait hydrography to this day. You've probably heard of Lort Stokes' research ship, the HMS Beagle, famous for its earlier association with Charles Darwin. Lord Stokes' chart of Hogan Island notes a hazard left there by the sealers, wild dogs, probably rabid with hunger on that barren island. A rock at the northern end of the Hogan Group is notable as providing Tasmania's only land boundary with Victoria. Boundary Islet, otherwise known as Seal Rock. I got a shaky, extreme telephoto shot of it from the heaving deck of the Nooramunga. 'Tis from the seagulls that alight on Boundary Islet that makes it white. Sorry, Spike Milligan. Other islands in the Hogan Group are notable bird rookeries: petrel, prion, gull, muttonbird, penguin. This chain of many islands and rocks from Victoria to Tasmania lay along our track. During the last ice age, with water locked in polar caps and sea levels much lower, these were high spots on a Bassian isthmus linking Victoria and Tasmania. Aborigines walked to Tasmania this way 30 or maybe 40,000 years ago. The passage from Hogan to Deal occupies another couple of hours. We were comfy in the cabin. Steve did some reading to keep his mind off seasickness and sleep deprivation. But Dave succumbed to the land of Nod. And I went down a steep stairway to see a man about a dog. Then, like magic through the salt-encrusted bow windows, the promised land. High, wild, and much more beautiful than any photos we'd seen. Dave reading about shipwrecks in the neighbourhood. Wynne checking cricket scores. Steve through the window, reclining against the starboard rail to settle his tum. Southwest Island, a Kent Group outlier. I went outside for the final approach. It was becoming spectacular, skirting east of Erith Island's cliffs and heading for Garden Cove on Deal. North East Isle, another Kent Group outlier, home to 200,000 pairs of mutton birds with a navlight on the top. The northern cliffs of Erith Island. That tiny white dot so high is Deal's lighthouse, where our light beam test would be. Murray Pass, the channel separating Erith from Deal, coming into view. Somewhere in those cliffs is the Great Cave of Erith, a deep fissure 50 metres above the sea, where evidence of human habitation 9,000 years ago was found. Then, as we cleared Murray Pass, the mystery locale of one of Deal Island's earliest sketches, the Giant's Rock, drawn in 1854 by the first Anglican Bishop of Tasmania, Francis Russell Nixon. The mystery revealed. It's now known as the Indian's Head. A close view of North East Island. And the neighbouring Anvil Rock. Henry and Steve were now so impressed by the scenery on such a perfect day that they were drinking it all in, exhaustion and nausea forgotten. Erith receding behind, and an islet off Pegleg with remnant eucalypts, saved from Deal's frequent fires by its geographical separation. We caught sight of the beach that was to become our home for the next 4 days. We were not alone at Garden Cove. In summer, yachties and runabouts frequently shelter here en route from Tasmania or Victoria, or just hang out fishing in the isolation. I later discovered that this was also occasionally used as an unpatrolled drop-off point for the international drug trade.
Yeah. But it's not hot down there.
Good. Cross my cover it. Show off to him, John.
Henry and Dave were the first to go ashore with the Zodiac. We made 3 trips in with
Dave
people
has
and
stepped
gear.
ashore.
The 4 of us, the former lighthouse keeper's daughter and her daughter. Tents, food, water in 2 40-litre jerry cans, which we set in the dunes above the tide. Cooking equipment, radio gear, the light beam transceiver, and the essential Jimmy's Thunderbox with sealable plastic box, to be returned to Melbourne. We were met by the patrolling locals. Every day these Cape Barren geese did their version of changing the guards at Buckingham Palace. There was no food for them on the beach, so why did they come here? Island caretaker Vicky in the overalls, with Wynne about to leave us. We had to carry this stash about 100 metres up by a creek to our grassy camping spot on a hill. And there goes our transport. I grab an armful of stuff and follow the boys. Thirsty locals on a warm afternoon. Bennett's wallaby are not native here, but they're in plague numbers, introduced around World War I as a food source if the lighthouse supply was late. Base camp. Yeah, pretty basic. After 3 hours of vomiting and 22 hours without sleep, I stuck my head into shade and flaked for about an hour. Best thing I could do. Steve was kind enough to set up my tent. I guess my age was telling. There was a continuous stream of neighbouring boats in Garden Cove over the next few days.
Give me a call and sure, I'll do that. I will.
After an evening snack, we went up the track to the old lighthouse residential compound. This is the swashway between Erith Island and Dover Island, and very distantly beyond you can see the mountains of Wilson's Promontory. See, we're at nightfall, and this is Steve by the Telstra seat, which is about halfway along the track to Garden Cove from the lighthouse settlement. Finally, I became part of something I'd only seen in this, the earliest photo ever taken on Deal, November 1890, the view of the lighthouse from the 1848 vintage settlement and the keeper's cottage, 173 years old. You'll find a continuation of this video in another YouTube posting.